Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special session on unlocking Africa's industrial corridors. I'm just going to start off by setting the scene here because Africa's transport corridors are expensive, inefficient, and as a result restrict business activity and impact on global competitiveness and intra-regional trade. Now, 97% of Africa's international trade passes through ports, and 80% of intra-African trade takes place through road and rail. However, according to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, transport costs for landlocked countries in sub-Saharan Africa account for more than 70% of the value of goods exports. Now, transnational transport corridors could have proven that they can be successful at lowering these costs. Our panel today will be looking at that key question. How exactly can transport corridors be transformed to drive local industrial development? Before we start this session, ladies and gentlemen, I would just like to remind you that we'll be taking some questions from the floor at some point during this discussion. So if you have any questions for members of the panel, you will have an opportunity to ask those questions. This is also a televised session on CGTN, which is China Global Television Network. So we will be restricting our time and our answers to fit in with that program. May I now introduce my members of the panel. Her Excellency is Sarah Kungogelwa Amadila. She is the Prime Minister of Namibia. Welcome to the panel. May I also introduce Siyabonga Gama. He's the Group Chief Executive Officer at Transnet South Africa. Welcome to the session. Mr. Johan Aurik, he's the Global Managing Partner and Chairman of the Board at Kearney in the UK. Welcome to the program. And Michael Druce, President, Africa UPS South Africa. Welcome to the session. Prime Minister, I'm going to start off with you because your government in Namibia says that it wants to turn Namibia into a logistics hub and highway for a gateway into the SADC region. First of all, how do you plan to do that? What are the strategies that are in place for this, and how do you expect this to impact on regional trade between Namibia and the SADC countries?
Yes, thank you very much. Namibia ranks very highly on its priority for the public budget, the development and the rehabilitation of transport infrastructures. They take up a large chunk of the government's budget, and we are also forging partnerships with the private sector by passing laws. Recently, we passed the Public-Private Partnership that will encourage the private sector to invest in the development of infrastructures of all sorts, actually, air, rail, road, harbor, and also to partner with us in the management of those infrastructures. Besides that, we believe that apart from locating ourselves as a transport and logistical hub to be the gateway for SADC to the Americas and Europe, we believe that that would also help us to optimize benefits from regional integration. Because what we have observed is that as African countries, we agree on an integration agenda in order to promote trade amongst us, but we find that we trade more with the world than with ourselves because we don't identify our competitive niches and advance them in order that we can promote the regional economic growth, and that is what Namibia is trying to do now. So through these infrastructures, we are linked with 6 to 7 countries with 3 different transport corridors, one going up north, the one down south, and the one to the east to link us with all these countries. And as I have said, that it would help us to be the gateway, but it will also make us an attractive investment ground because we are a small economy with 2 million people. And we believe that we'll be able to attract investors only if they know that by locating in Namibia, they have access to the regional market, which is a much bigger market, and also that through logistics and transport, we can also generate jobs and income for Namibia.
Right. Siyabonga Gama, because you're in rails and roads, and you're with Transnet here, and the Prime Minister has talked about being able to link countries within the SADC region. Now, the AFDB and the African Union, though, and UNECA as well, say that they're building a transnational highway, but that they do need about $32 billion to make this a feasibility. Practically on the ground today, what is happening with Africa's interconnectivity? Where are we? How feasible is this?
Yeah, I think everything when analyzed properly, and when we have the correct data and the correct feasibility studies, can in fact materialize. And I think as Africa, we do agree that we all trade outside of Africa more than we trade inside Africa, and that our ability to improve and increase intra-African trade is actually quite critical. So the transport system is crucial in terms of linking those who are involved in trade in terms of imports and exports. We need to therefore make sure that we have an integrated planning and development framework that seeks to link different countries so that we can move goods from one area to the other. So from where we sit, we need to then say there are these infrastructure gaps, there is this huge or seemingly huge amount of money that is required to do so. But I think everybody that we speak to indicates that it's not really a dearth of funding. The real issues are around making sure that we've got credible feasibility studies that are done and funding is available. So what we need to do is to really deepen our understanding of the constraints that are faced by different countries, but also we must measure, gather, analyze, and ensure that we've got the appropriate data that is going to assist us in terms of being able to come up with these credible feasibility studies.
All right, Mr. Aurik, though, the whole idea of transport corridors, they have been on the agenda, Africa's agenda since 1970s, and your company, though, a report presented by your company last year did suggest that infrastructure quality and connectivity in Africa is what is stopping investors' ability to invest on the continent. What, in your view, though, is hampering the development of transport corridors on the continent?
I think at the highest level, there are three big areas where we need to make improvement on, and some were already mentioned previously. The first and most important thing, I think, is transport corridors is not a matter of concrete or of funds in the first place. You have to take a systems view of this. It's absolutely essential. It's only when everything works together in harmony that it begins to work. And that sounds maybe very simple, but it's something that a lot of people often forget. You need tax systems, you need standards, you need, look across all the borders in Africa, you often see rows and rows of trucks waiting. And it's not necessary, really. We all understand why we're there, but it's really not necessary. So it's really important to take that systems view and to work at all the different levels. And I know a lot of people are doing that. The African Union is doing it, a lot of governments are doing that, but that is the biggest single issue. So it's not funds, there's a lot of money available. There's a backlog of projects, and it's not the concrete, it's really the overall system that doesn't work. So that's number one. The number two is, the minister rightfully said so, Africa needs to shift from global export of raw materials largely to more a mix of global export and intra-African trade. It's really essential. The global economy is slowing down, trade is slowing down, African population is growing, and it's absolutely essential that Africa harvests the wealth that it has, and that is really, it needs to be unlocked, and you unlock that by largely working on African trade. Very hard to do, we all know that, but it's incredibly important to do so. That's the number two. The number three is technology. Often forgotten, but a lot of global supply chains and global systems are going through fundamental change right now. Robotics, artificial intelligence, IoT, all those aspects. And it leads often to more local production. That's one of the biggest effects that it has. And also for that reason, Africa needs to step up in terms of its technology. It helps intra-African trade, and it needs to be facilitated by well-functioning system corridors. Those are the three biggest trends that I would.
So Michael Druce here, Africa needs to step up its technology, though, and the African continent is said to have the highest transport costs in the world. You operate on the continent, though. what extra, how is this though, the high cost, how is this affecting your supply? What extra costs do you need to bear as a result of this lack of connectivity?
I think there's two sides to this. One is, what type of logistics and transportation are FDIs looking for? Anybody that wants to come into Africa and develop manufacturing capacity, the first thing they're going to look at is logistics. Yes, power is important. Availability of land to build and to grow is important. But logistics is key, because unless you can get your product to market, then you're going to struggle to compete with imports that are coming into Africa. And we've talked already about the fact that so little of Africa's trade is intra-Africa, and based on the last WTO statistics, 17% of trade stays within Africa. Compare that with Asia, which is sitting at 48%. Okay? Europe's as high as 65%. Well, Europe's a single market, so you'd expect that. So how does that change, and how do we change it? How do we encourage FDIs to come in, build manufacturing capacity? Well, the key is providing with logistics capability. Now, if we look at the growth in Asia over the last 30 to 40 years, they pioneered a concept called just-in-time. Started in Japan back in the 70s. And that revolutionized manufacturing and production in Asia. And if you look at places like Thailand now, Thailand produces 60% of the components that go into Japanese cars. So manufacturing happens wherever businesses want it, because the logistics is there to support it. And going back to what the Prime Minister of Namibia was saying earlier, they want to attract manufacturing that could feed into supply chains in other countries. So the key to that is the ability to move components and finished products quickly across borders. And at the moment, too much of what is imported into Africa ends up in warehouses, purely because people are so worried about their supply chains, they hold stock. And as we know, capital is not cheap in Africa, so that adds to the challenges that businesses face, where they have to keep large amounts of stock in warehouses rather than be able to bring it in as and when they need it.
Right, and so I come back to you, Prime Minister, because you've heard the views from the panelists, and Siyabonga Gama there said it is not just about money. So do the experiences from the panelists on the floor, do they resonate with what you're trying to do? And what is your biggest challenge when you're trying to create your logistics hub?
Yes, they do resonate with us. Namibia is a member of SACU and SADC, and to address the issue of the need for us to have clear plans and to ensure that all systems go, all important aspects are given considerations to, we have a regional development plan for SADC that incorporates an infrastructure development fund. We have agreed to establish institutions that would support the financing for these infrastructures. We have agreed on an integration plan that also addresses the other aspects, like a cross-border movement of goods and people, the regulatory framework, the policies to create certainty for investors. I have talked about the public-private partnership, the reforms in order to deepen and strengthen the regulation of our financial sector and to promote financial inclusion. These are all things that we are working on. For Namibia, the special challenge really is the vastness of the land, given its small population, and the way that people are settled, because we do not only have to link to other countries within SADC and to link the production centers to export exit points. We also have to link communities to critical services, for example, in addition to linking production centers to markets within the country. So that is the largest challenge for us. But in terms of savings, we are leading amongst the leaders within the region. We actually do export much of our capital to Big Brother down south. So our challenge maybe is to develop our capital markets so that we strengthen its capacity to intermediate and allocate the local savings to local investments. And the other challenge is now to attract the foreign investors by addressing the skills shortages that we are faced with. And in this regard, we are not only prioritizing that within the budget, we are also looking at attracting private investors into the sector.
Right, Siyabonga, Gama, those 6 countries in the SADC region are landlocked there, but there are about 18 transport corridors going across the region. What are the major constraints, though, in terms of connectivity for these 18 corridors?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with either old or dilapidated infrastructure, which needs to be upgraded. Some of the corridors, they exist in terms of name, but they are not fully operational because of some of those bottlenecks. So investment in infrastructure is important. Sometimes there's also just squabbling between countries to say, in terms of these different links, who is responsible for what kind of investment. So that also creates constraints. But I think there is an overall political will from an AU perspective to say, let us look at all of these corridors, and there are champions that have been chosen in terms of each of these corridors to say, how do you debottleneck each one of them? But I think the other problem is that even though these corridors, they cut through countries, the decision-making has to take place in individual countries. How do you integrate this? How do you make sure that when you start making an investment in one part of the corridor, that there's other investments that are properly timed elsewhere in order for that to happen? So sometimes you get the notion that we also have too many decision-making layers. We don't make decisions quickly enough. But also sometimes there's just over-regulation, which then gets into the face and the place of implementation. And then we find that we are not making progress as quickly as we would want to do. So we need to then begin to say, in each of these corridors, if someone is a champion, can they take overall responsibility in terms of the kinds of decisions that need to get taken in order for that corridor to be debottlenecked? Because with each corridor that we are able to debottleneck, we can increase intra-African trade tenfold, because we are now able to move the vast mineral resources that the continent has from producers to where the markets are. Because that is the critical thing that is going to create jobs. That is the critical thing that is going to make sure that we've got economic growth, that we can bring about a better standard of living to our people. The other constraint that we have is also the constraint of power and energy. It's quite important that that constraint also gets removed, because if we are to beneficiate, as you said in your opening statement, we need quite a bit of energy. So it is energy, it is the transport corridors themselves, which will assist us in terms of linking producers, importers and exporters.
So if you look at it though, Mr. Aurik, against the background of what's just been mentioned there, how do you then raise Africa's competitiveness against all those constraints?
The short answer is that it's very hard, Beatrice. I mentioned that this is a systems issue, so it's not one part. You need various parties and various aspects to work together. So this progress will for sure be slow, but it does not mean that we should be dissuaded from that. There are many nice areas where you can point to progress. If I can mention one, the Maputo Port Development Company. What was it, 10, 15 years? I think that's about the time that it has been going. I think the decision originally by the government to allow for that and to put that was courageous. It's a public-private partnership, so funded by South African players, by Dubai World from the Middle East, and by Mozambique comes. It's a combined effort. It's not only the pure port and the pure infrastructure that created the system, and I think it has been, many people would agree, a resounding success. Of course, there are things that can be done better. That's always that way, but it can be done if you put things together. So to try to solve everything at once, all the problems at once, Africa with its 53 countries, and to do everything at the same time is very, very hard to do. The African Union should do it, by the way, and we should certainly push them to do that. But it's very hard. I think it's often easier to take small areas, between two countries, ports, corridors, etc., and try to make progress there and to take it in step by step. That is how I would approach it.
So, Michael, Druce, though, there must be some innovative ways that your company is dealing with or finding in order to overcome all these constraints. Otherwise, you'd be out of business. So what are those innovative ways that you're finding to deal with the constraints on the continent?
Okay. Well, I'll come to that in a moment, but I just want to expand on what Johan just said about some good examples of where progress has been made. If we look at East Africa is developing the East Africa Customs Union. And getting back to what my colleague from Transnet just said, governments working together is key. And yes, companies like ours, we can put technology in place, we can put all kinds of processes and systems in place, but we're still very much dependent on the customs authorities and the will of governments to make meaningful change. And we heard an awful lot a year ago in Kigali about what's happening in the East Africa Customs Union. We're seeing examples of it ourselves. You can now move goods freely from Kenya into Rwanda, into Uganda, and they're developing the transport networks to help build on that as well. So I think East Africa is a good example of what can happen if governments and leadership put their mind to making meaningful change. And logistics companies like ourselves will very quickly adapt our own systems and processes to work within those capabilities. But it all comes back down to will, because traditionally across Africa, the customs authorities have tended to be revenue collectors rather than trade facilitators. And that has to slowly change as well. Yes, the fiscus is important, but without fast and quick movement of goods, it's very hard for foreign companies to come in and say, we want to put a manufacturing operation in a Rwanda or in a Kenya or in a Tanzania, because they want to serve other markets. They don't just want to serve the domestic market, but they don't want to be constrained by the inability to move stuff across borders because of the difficulties with customs clearance and the bureaucracy that exists, particularly if they have to cross more than one border. So from our perspective, technology and using data efficiently to clear goods before they've even left, so that on arrival they can be delivered straight to the customer instead of to a warehouse, is something that we're starting to see much more in Africa. The bandwidth is available, the technology is available, the data is available. Customs are becoming more receptive, but it's a slow process, and what we're looking for is more leadership, similar to what we're seeing in East Africa.
But are you seeing, though, are there regions, either from the east, the west, the north, or the south, that are actually starting to get their connectivity right, that are starting to lower the costs of doing business there? Are there blocks that are already doing that?
Yes. East Africa, SADC is starting to do the same. It's becoming a lot more united and integrated in what it's doing. And the other piece of this is the government departments working together, because you've got different departments who've got an interest in the movement of goods, whether it's the health people, the narcotics people, customs, all the regulatory bodies working together, and that's something else that's happening in East Africa. They're starting to integrate and work together, so you don't arrive at the border and you have to talk to customs, then you have to talk to the health department, or if you bring it in pharmaceuticals, the drug regulator, one after the other. They're now getting together and starting to streamline the process, again using technology to speed it up, and that will encourage more and more investment from people who want to manufacture pharmaceutical products, for example, because they'll be able to move those across border much more efficiently and transparently without all these potential delays and issues that they face.
Okay, so we're going to take your questions in a minute, and you can also send in some of your questions to the hashtag Africa Corridor, and we will read out some of your questions in a minute, and in a few minutes we will be doing that. But Prime Minister, I just wanted to come back to you because an issue has been mentioned here about public-private partnerships here, and one of the issues regarding ports and railways and roads in Africa is that it is normally managed by parastate, also by government institutions. Are we starting to see more emphasis now, or are we starting to see more introduction of public-private partnerships? I know the Walvis Bay Corridor Group is one such group.
Yes, indeed. As was indicated, the challenge is not only the lack of resources. In fact, in some of our countries, as I have indicated, the resources is not an issue. It's only that the resources are actually not in the hands of government. The resources are out there in the private sector, and you have to incentivize the private sector to come in by having policies that are clear and give reassurance to private sector that they are going to have their investments protected and they are going to be able to recover the returns from their investments. And Namibia is one of those countries that they have been working on a public-private partnership arrangement. We had our bill promulgated into law just last month in Namibia, and we have already selected a number of projects that we want to use as a pilot to establish the viability or the best ways that we will operationalize the public-private partnership in the country. And as was also indicated in regard to a number of other challenges, we are, as part of SADC and SACU, also addressing the issue of connectivity in terms of ICT, automating government services, streamlining the procedures at the border, strengthening cooperation with other countries to make sure that we do not only have the infrastructures, but that when businesses move along these infrastructures, we limit the time that they spend on the road, we limit the inconveniences that they go through, we limit the costs that they have to incur in order to go through, that the regulatory systems are not overly burdensome so that businesses could prosper. And we have also looked at the area of taxation, coming up with an automated system of tax management so that people will be able to file on the system, for example, and get their returns processed in the shortest possible time. So we agree that it's a whole range of issues that we have to address, and we as SADC, we believe that coming from a common monetary area, which is the highest level of integration that we have in Africa, to SACU, which has a common pool, customs pool, in addition to a common external tariff, we want to bring all these positive experiences to SADC so that we can also then bring on board others that are not members of SACU in the common monetary area.
Right. Yes, Siyabonga.
I think also perhaps what we need to do is to pick a few critical regions and issues. If, for instance, we take the system of ports, because I think ports are an important aspect. We have too many small ports, which means we don't get the benefits of scale, and we don't get the benefits of density as well, because we do not have big hinterlands, or the hinterlands that we ought to have are not integrated in terms of either road or rail, in terms of the back of port activities. So one of the things that we probably should look at is what kind of collaborative strategies should we have, and what kind of specialization should each region have? Because you know, we do have what I call a Me Too mentality, where everybody says, so-and-so has done this, so therefore I'm going to do it. So we end up competing, but when we compete, we actually increase costs. We need to be beginning to say, if we have a system of ports, what is the kind of regional ports master plan that we could have? Concentrate on a few to bring out benefits, because at the end of the day, it is about reducing the cost of doing business. If we want to be competitive, we need to make sure that these corridors actually come out with supply chains that are efficient and competitive, because it is supply chains that compete. So it is really of no use for us to try and do too many things without focusing on a few things that are going to strengthen our regions, strengthen our supply chains. Maybe we should not look at some of these things just from a country-to-country perspective. We should begin to say, in a particular country, which port is going to become a bulk port? What is the kind of rail and road infrastructure that must connect with it? Where are the critical minerals and resources that to be moved? Where are the markets? So what is the best place, either east, west, or south, for us to make sure that we strengthen those supply chains? I think that kind of discussion around cooperation, around density, around specialization around economies of scale can assist us in terms of saying, how do we create better market access and make sure that we don't try to do too many things at once, but we really focus on the things that are going to give us the highest impact in terms of Pareto optimality.
Yes, Mr. Aurik.
If I can follow up on that. I strongly agree with that. More specialization and more focus and more scale and more in-depth investment is absolutely key to make this work. This is very hard to do with 53 governments. Just look at the difficulties that Europe has with 27. And therefore, I would argue to try to do that in the first place with a few countries or a few people that are aligned and that want to make that happen, like in East Africa, the example, or South Africa, etc. It's a much better way of doing that. I would not want to focus, though, this conversation too much on the difficulties, because we often tend to talk about the difficulties. And there are many, as we all know. This is not easy to do, because, as I said, it's a system change that needs to take place. But the price is fantastically high. I would give you the example of India. For decades, India was always a promise, but it never happened. And if you see now, in a few years, but for instance, the tax borders between different states in India is gradually being reduced. If you see the impact that it has on economic growth, on foreign investment, on investment within India, on employment, on absolutely everything else, it's fantastic. The population, the biggest resource of Africa is not the commodities, it's its people. And a lot of people tend to forget that. And that's a fantastic resource. If you can unlock that, perhaps not always at the level of 53 countries, but at subsets, and make concrete progress there, the price is fantastic, and I would be optimistic about that.
Right, Michael Druce, because earlier on it was mentioned here by Siyabonga here that perhaps the operational systems now are starting to kick in. As you traverse the continent, though, are you starting to see a lot more of a streamlining of regulation of operational systems on the continent?
It's quite sporadic. I touched on East Africa earlier, and SADC is also starting to get a lot more aligned. But one of the real challenges that a lot of companies face is the fact that they have to cross multiple borders. And keeping stocking facilities, for example, you take high-tech companies, they want to support their businesses and their engineers. They have to keep stocking locations in every single country. They're unable to set up a stocking location in South Africa, for example, because as soon as they move those goods across the border into Namibia or into Botswana or Zambia, they have to then, if they don't keep it in bond, they have to pay duties again, because you can't clear at the first country of arrival, because, again, there's a lack of cooperation between governments. So if South Africa collects the revenue and the goods end up in Namibia, South Africa then hands that revenue over to Namibia. That isn't taking place at the moment, and it's fueled growth in Europe over the last 30 years, the ability to clear in the country of arrival. So East Africa, again, is looking at this, is saying, well, if we clear goods in Kenya, can we then move them freely into Rwanda and Uganda? And the ability to do that, again, is going to be transformational, because people will then be able to look at where they want to keep their critical stock if they're forced to do that, because that's a lot more cost effective than either flying it indirect because of the time it takes. So if they have to keep stock, far better to be able to keep it in one location and then move it through a cluster of countries using, whether it's express operators, cargo operators. We haven't talked an awful lot about, you know, the role air freight plays in Africa. It's very much a perishables that move more by air freight and high-tech goods. But again, what's Africa going to do about developing its infrastructure to move critical items by air? Again, back to the whole just-in-time thing I spoke about earlier.
Right. So Johan, Aurik, you've told us not to dwell too much on the negatives, and we're going to get some solutions here in a minute. But are there any questions from the floor? We can take a few questions before we proceed with this session. Anyone with the questions? If not, we'll proceed quite quickly. But before we get to the solution aspect of it, I want to hear from you, Prime Minister, because you're the policymaker on this session. And a lot of countries now, particularly a number of Western countries, I wouldn't say a lot of countries, a number of Western countries are starting to look national as opposed to being part of regional blocks. What do you think Africa is going to do? How much of an impact is this going to be on Africa, particularly since we've just talked about Africa's share of global trade being like at 3% and Africa's intra-Africa trade stagnating at about 11%?
Yes, for Africa, as I had indicated, many of our countries are small countries with small populations and small economies, and we have struggled actually to secure our interest in the global market, and we see the future for African economies is lying in the integration of African economies so that we can engage the rest of the global economy as one economic bloc, and we would therefore forge ahead, and we feel actually challenged to accelerate the pace of implementing our integration agenda and deepening it on the African continent. As of now, the happenings around the world require us to look at how we maintain the benefits that we had secured with those regional blocs. If United Kingdom has decided to exit from the European Union, and now one of the candidates in the French presidential elections is also talking about getting France to quit. That is a matter for concern. We actually have to look at how we can ensure that the gains that we had made with the European Union, with France and UK in it, can be maintained by pursuing arrangements with these two countries, but it then means that we have to move faster really to ensure, as we have indicated, that we do not only implement the integration agenda, but that we create value chains across borders so that we have activities happening in all our countries that would ensure that when the regional economy grows, all of us would share in the prosperity. And I think the point that was raised there about the importance of making sure that we facilitate the movement of people and goods across the borders by promoting cooperation between governments is also an issue that we are looking at in Namibia as a member of SADC. We are optimizing the bilateral cooperation that we have with individual member states to make sure that there is a smooth movement of goods across the borders, using things like the bond security, for example, where really one does not have to pay at every border. Within SACU already we do have that arrangement that you pay where you enter the goods within the region, never mind where the money is going to end up. And where you have to physically move goods across the borders, we definitely work hard also to ensure that you don't have to pay at every border and then be refunded, where that is the case, as is the case with SACU, for example.
Right, Siyabonga Gama, I'll come back to your point about, you did mention earlier on at the beginning of this session that it is not just about money, that money can be found. But if you look at the connectivity of countries and you look at their levels of development, the varying levels of development, starting from Namibia, Botswana, to South Africa, or even Lesotho, where will they find this money to ensure that there is that connectivity from ports all the way to the hinterland?
Yeah, I think probably what we need to zero in is to say, having identified and defined the corridors, each country must then say what role does it play in that corridor and what kind of bilateral does it require with the adjacent country or a country that's contiguous to it in order to make the entire corridor work. I mean, the Development Bank of South Africa, the IDC, the PIC, the African Development Bank. We've got many financial institutions that are ready and are willing to fund infrastructure programs, but they need to be presented in a particular way. The funding, to me, is not an issue. I think what we should be saying is that each country or each corridor has got an industrialization objective. So therefore, what investment program is going to assist it in terms of creating this? But I think also, I think we need to also zero in on this issue of the markets and the size of the markets. Because I think if we look at everything just in terms of each country, our countries are very small in terms of creating a big enough market. We should be saying, how do we expand these markets? We don't necessarily need to look at what is happening in the rest of the world. I think if we can create one common market for Africa, we are talking about just over 1 billion people. 35 to 40% of that is youth. There's a lot of things that are going to be required. There's internet connectivity that is required in terms of telecoms and power. There is a lot, I think, that we should be able to do going forward, but it starts with forward planning, it starts with foresight, but it also begins to say, when we cooperate and we work together and we say, how do we make quicker decisions? Where will that get us to? So I think the issue of funding for me is not really a constraint in terms of capacitating, or creating the kinds of mechanisms that we need in order for us to move forward. I think funding is not an issue, but I think governments must assist us in terms of creating some of these common markets, ECOWAS, COMESA, the preferential trade area, the 26 countries together with SADC, and then start to have common laws. We must go counter to Brexit in order for us to move forward. But I think the other problem that we've been having as a globalizing world is that the fruits of globalization have not been shared by everybody, which is why countries are now going nationalistic rather than global. So the whole notion of inclusive growth comes into the fore. How do we make sure that we create wealth that is shared by everybody? How do we make sure that everyone is participating? How do we move the vast majority of Africa's people from the periphery to the center? So these are the kinds of questions as we fund, as we invest, that we need to also begin to answer, because if we are to accelerate, the notion of inclusive growth is critical. We must make sure that everybody participates.
Right, Mr. Aurik.
If I can extrapolate on that, if you take a step back, you mentioned the word globalization. The big movement of globalization in the world was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And if you see indeed over the last years, just read the newspaper, increasingly that's being challenged. Global trade is growing for several years already much less than the global GDP growth, meaning that more and more growth takes place within countries. Including China, is shifting from a global low-cost, low labor cost export model to a more high value-added internal consumption model. So if you add all these trends up, slowly the world economy, for several reasons, not only economics, certainly also politics, is shifting from globalization to what we call islandization, meaning that more and more of the economy, a bigger portion of the economy, is taking place within regions or within countries, certainly within regions. And I think actually, if you think that through, it's an opportunity for Africa. It has a lot of impact though when we talk about transport corridors. The model where there's only an export out in terms of raw materials through the ports and coming in from wherever country it's imported in, that model will increasingly be challenged, and that's why I'm arguing, and I think we all are, so strongly for boosting and for developing intra-African trade. It's, I think, an opportunity for Africa that needs to be picked up.
Right, Michael Druce.
I think, going back to the point Johan's just made, there's a huge, the trade imbalance creates another issue, particularly for the ports and for the steamship companies, for example. They've got huge volumes coming in, they go out virtually empty. So the opportunity for companies that come into Africa, not only to develop inter-Africa trade, but also to export. And there are trade agreements out there that allow, there's the AGOA agreement, for example, where manufacturers in Southern Africa can ship into the US and get trade benefits. But not enough of that is being taken advantage of. because the shipping lines will give very cheap rates for exports, because they'd much rather fill their containers at low rates than send them back empty, which is what they have to do today. So I think there's so many opportunities that can be grasped, providing we can overcome the bottlenecks and the gaps that have been created through a lack of investment and leadership by government and by industry as well, because I think we're all responsible and we all have to work together to overcome those.
All right, I'm going to ask again if there are any questions from the floor before we go to our final round of questions and conclusions for this section. Unfortunately, my iPad has malfunctioned, so I'm going to have to take questions from the floor. Are there any questions from the floor for our panelists? Prime Minister, let me just come back to you here as we end up on this, in this section. So, the best way for African countries to transform their transport corridors, because Mr. Aurik there says we need to look at the solutions, we need to look at the positives. What would you say would be the best way for African countries to transform their transport corridors? What are the innovative ways that other countries, whether it is in the SADC region or in other parts of the continent, what are they doing to enhance their connectivity?
Yes, I think as has been mentioned already, we have to make sure that we have integrated plans that would make sure that we are agreed on what the priorities are and how the implementation is going to be faced. We have to ensure that we mobilize the stakeholders to make sure that the appropriate resources that are required to implement these infrastructures are mobilized. We have to make sure that there is cooperation between governments in terms of implementation and all the supportive aspects, including border activities, common policies are addressed. We have to make sure that we have activities that are actually supported by these infrastructures. I think that's very, very important. We have come to realize that even within countries, because previously it was about equity. We must have a road here, we must have a rail in that region or in that province, but it is now coming to what is that road saving? You are connecting this center to this market or to this export point or to this country that is a partner within the region, and we have to to harness the ICT to make sure that we streamline the bureaucracies of government and optimize cooperation at the borders. I think that becomes very, very important, and that there are common policies actually to make sure that we grow together. At the end of the day, I think that's very important. And now, for small countries like Namibia, of course, we know that competition with other countries cannot be a negative one. It cannot be a case of getting better than South Africa. It's about how do we really make sure that whatever is happening within the region, or Angola, or Zambia, or Zimbabwe, whatever we are doing in the region is optimizing returns to the region and also is ensuring that everybody shares in the cake. That, at the end of the day, I think is very, very important. And these cross-border activities, this value chain, whether it is in the primary sector or in the value addition, are very, very important, or it's in terms of regulation and policies. I think these are very, very important.
Right, Siyabonga Gama. If you look back now, because you're in the rail and road sector, what do you see as the best forward? Because you're practicing practically down there, what do you think is the best way forward to enhance our connectivity?
I think we also need to streamline the agencies that are involved in the transport and logistics game. For instance, if you look at the Transnet model, you have the pipeline, you have the ports, you have the railway in one entity. So when you make an investment in the ports, you understand fully what it means in terms of the required investment in rail. In other countries, we still have too many, in-country fragmentation in terms of, trying to debottleneck. So part of the infrastructure program investment that is required is how do you harmonize that? So I would invite people to come and have a look at the Transnet model, but Transnet can also come into the countries and assist in terms of some of this harmony, because some of it becomes just a lot of intra-country noise where there is not a lot that is happening from the investment space, because another arm of the same country is doing something that is counter to what could create the kind of cooperation and the integration that we're looking at. So when you begin to say, let us look at solutions, let's look at mechanisms that capacitate those organs of state to function much more effectively, but also transform them into learning organizations that can go and learn from other areas in the world. Track performance. It's very important that you have a performance management system that measures the rate of intake in terms of when you create this infrastructure, what is the macroeconomic output that you are gaining as a result of that, so that we can continuously make progress.
Right, Mr. Aurik, how do we transform, how do we change, how do we develop our transport corridors?
First of all, don't focus on the hard stuff, focus on the soft stuff, meaning, of course, infrastructure and the capital is important, but the soft stuff, the regulations, the improvements, the borders, the difficulties, agents working together, the examples of being able to move inventories around Africa, that is often where the biggest barriers are. So focus everyone's attention on that in the first place. Second, Africa is 53 relatively small economies, but with a fantastic opportunity and enormous potential, bigger than any other place in the world. But to do that with 53 always is very hard to do. So focus on smaller subsets. I'd rather have 1,000 flowers that bloom than one big one. And it's often easier to do these small steps. So focus on that in the first place. And finally, be optimistic, because like I said, the potential is enormous. I often find people, certainly in Africa, being more pessimistic and looking more into problems rather than at the price that's there to be gotten by working together and doing things together and focusing on that.
You're very optimistic here, but if I can just come back briefly and ask you, if there was one issue that you thought needed urgent attention today, would it be policy? What would it be if there was one issue that you could mention?
It would be policies that allows companies, whether it's a multinational from abroad or whether African companies, to easier trade and move goods, capital, and people across borders. If I can put it in the simplest possible way, that is what I call the soft stuff. Focus on that. And whether you do that in an East Africa model between a few countries there, or wherever it is in Africa, or even within smaller regions, that doesn't matter as long as you make progress focusing on that in the first place. So I don't think it's the hard stuff, it's the infrastructure, even though it's important, of course, but it's that soft stuff that's, I think, where the biggest barriers are.
Right, Michael Druce, your way forward for African countries to develop their transport corridors to ease your workload and your costs, bring them down?
I think all stakeholders have to start listening. We have to start listening, we have to start working together in working groups involving government agencies, and asking difficult questions and listening to what we have to do. We have to listen to our customers or we don't survive. Government has to start listening to stakeholders and saying, what can we do to improve? And then go away and make meaningful change that will then allow those improvements to take place. But as Johan said, it's got to be focused. There's no point in trying to do Joburg, Nigeria, Joburg, Ghana, Joburg, Kenya. We have to start looking at opportunities where we can make small changes that will make a difference. Namibia is a great example because it's so close to South Africa. It's a key partner, and start looking at the surrounding countries. Today, there's only 4 countries you can move goods overnight from South Africa reliably. Namibia is one of them, Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland. Well, we've got to start looking at Zimbabwe, we've got to start looking at Mozambique, we've got to start looking at Zambia. Geographically, they're close enough. So let's start working with those governments and ensuring that all the stakeholders come together and say, how do we replicate what we do with Namibia? How do we replicate what we do with Botswana? And I think if we do that, we start making a meaningful difference, and then we start building up momentum, and then people start realizing that things can change, they can improve, and foreign investors will start seeing this and saying, well, there is hope.
Since you have the policymaker on the set here, what would be that one critical issue that you think needs urgent attention?
I really think it's customs, it's the regulatory authorities, customs. There has to be a mindset shift in customs. I spoke about it earlier. They have to move from being revenue collectors to trade facilitators. Revenue collection is important, but that is a byproduct. They also have to have a mindset of trade facilitation and not look for reasons why goods should stop, but reasons why goods should move. Because at the end of the day, somebody's waiting, and what they can't afford is the delays that consistently occur.
I'm told my time is up, but I want to hear your one critical issue.
As I said, it's about implementation of an integrated system.
Right. Prime Minister, you have the final word.
Yes, I would agree with that and say as a government, we want to call upon our stakeholders in the private sector to work with us in operationalizing these systems that we have put in place, the one-stop border post, the customs cooperation at the borders, the ITAs, the public-private partnership. I think with this, really, if we can implement them in true partnership, we are going to realize a lot of positive results.
All right. Thank you, members of the panel. We'll leave it there for the moment, and that is it for this session. Her Excellency Sarah Kugongelwa Amadila, the Prime Minister of Namibia. Thank you. Siyabonga Gama, Group Chief Executive Officer, Transnet South Africa. Mr. Johan Aurik, Global Managing Partner and Chairman of the Board, AT Kearney. And Mr. Michael Druce, President, Africa, UPS, South Africa. Thank you very much for being on this session, and thank you very much for joining us in this discussion. This session is a wrap. Bye-bye.